Good morning. How are you today? I just looked at myself on the video and I have this collar. It makes me look like the the priest from The Exorcist or something. Oh, that's funny. I didn't mean to look like that. So I have to remember not to wear a white t-shirt under this sweater. This is my favorite sweater that I have from somebody whom I love dearly. But I'll make sure I don't wear a white t-shirt. I'm going to get rid of my sunglasses and put on my regular glasses so I can see what I'm doing. There we go. That's better. How are you this morning? It's beautiful out today. Just a beautiful day. Um, Chapter 6, The End of Faith with Sam Harris. First time I had to read the chapter twice. I started to get a little bit of feeling that this chapter might have been a team effort, and maybe he's editing it because it's coming from a lot of different angles, a lot of different materials. But if he put this together by himself, it's a piece of work. I mean, it's a lot of, I don't know. I mean, this guy has got a lot of, what would I say, intellectual ability. I gotta admit it, right? I mean, chapter 6, well, let's get right into it. It's called The Science of Good and Evil. And like I said, I had to go through it twice because this can really stop you in your tracks. What is the author trying to say in this chapter? Let's the title of the book, The End of Faith, Religion, Terror, and the Future of Reason, Sam Harris. And let's get right into it here. So he talks about, he wants to address good and evil from a scientific perspective, right? He's sort of saying basically, what is good and evil? What is right and wrong? He says back in the 16th century, they thought that cat burning was a lot of fun because, and he kind of alluded to that a little earlier where he said the zeitgeist of a culture or of the world itself can change and evolve over time. Now, he doesn't get into, well, I'll mention it a little later. But so, yeah, he says what's right or wrong. It would depend on the happiness or suffering of sentient creatures, he says, right? If he says if there's no, he says there's no such thing as a crime without having a victim. It's no victim, no crime. He repeats that idea. And he says the idea for the basis for good and evil, right and wrong, he says, must be in the present because the ideas that people had in the past were wrong. That's his one argument that he presents, right? And of course, that gives him fuel to reject religious ideas because 99% of religious ideas are based on ideas from the past. So I can see where he's going here, right? He's creating a very powerful argument for where he wants to take the discussion. He's saying ethical intuitions must have their, he calls it precursors, not a good word to use, must have their precursors in the natural world, biology. They must have their foundation, would be a better word, in the idea of biology. And of course, he's alluding to evolution. Um, and he eventually is going to get to evolution being the only basis for an idea of good and evil, right and wrong. Now, I don't know how he's going to get there. I don't think he does get there. He gets there by referring to Hitchens, which I'll mention in a second. But I'll just throw in an argument here, is that no matter how hard they try, atheists, or let's say a modern version of ethics, something that's not based on past history, because he dismisses past history. He says they were wrong. They were burning cats back then. They didn't know what they were talking about. And he does a parallel with scientific ideas as well. He says if you went to the past and asked people about what's fire or what are the stars in the sky, they wouldn't have a clear understanding. So they didn't have a clear understanding of science. They didn't have a clear understanding of ethics. So everything we base on ethics must be based on the here and now. Okay, this is where he's at. Yet I will just throw out here, whenever a new religion or a new morality or a new tangent of religion, or whenever atheists, new atheists, you could call them the new atheists, they're often called, come up with an idea of ethics, why do they always refer back to a version of the golden rule? And it's usually a convoluted version. It's usually not as simple as the version that was left with us, dare I say, in the Bible, because I don't use the Bible as my foundation. I use the words of Christ as my foundation. And for me, in particular, there's two very different things. Um, but I'll leave that for now. Then he's saying that, right, he says that the horrors, basically he's saying the horrors of life are not commensurate. Again, I don't know why he used that word. The horrors of life are not compatible, I would say, with a designer God. This is kind of like the argument that he makes. He says that the horrors of life are a natural product of evolution, because evolution is mayhem. It's like people born with no arms and legs, and he uses as an example, or animals that are weird, or crazy things that we see in nature that are horrific, animals eating each other and stuff like this. And he says this is a normal part of evolution, but as far as having a perfect God in existence, it's not compatible with that, because there's too much horrific things like smallpox. He said if there was a perfect God, you'd never have had that happen, and the current diseases and all that kind of stuff. And so he says, he quotes, whenever he reaches the point of his main thrust, he often brings in another person to solidify his argument. In this case, he brings in Bertrand Russel, and later he brings in Hitchens. Bertrand Russell says that millions of years of lifeless nebulae have, that God took all this time to create the whole universe of galaxies and all that kind of stuff, only to arrive at a place where Hitler, Stalin, and the H-bomb arrive on the scene. He says he kind of says it doesn't make sense, and he calls this a devastating observation. However, if you look in the Bible, when it forecasts, or it prophesies that wicked leaders are going to arise, and even descriptions that parallel the phenomena of an H-bomb, where men in flames, right, their skin falling off them, and in shock, it's a very horrific description. So his argument here doesn't wash. That's saying that, oh, it doesn't make any sense to pull ethics from there, because it has no comment to make on the current state of affairs. Or he goes back to Bertrand Russell, his reasoning, and Bertrand Russell did a lot of studies about Job and stuff like that, and saying that, they're incompatible with a loving God, and on and on and on. It's all individual perspective. So he makes an interesting comment. He says, if these are the characteristics of God, then we've been created in his image far more than we could have hoped. And this is what I would repeat again about the description that Dawkins used in his book, when he said how horrific God was and all these horrible qualities. And I remember saying in one of my videos, you're describing men as much as you're describing God. And here too, he agrees with this idea that there's more parallel between God of the Bible and human men than we realize. And, which one mirrors the other is up for debate. And then he says that theology is just a branch of ignorance. No, it's not just a branch of ignorance. It would be a branch of human understanding. It would be a branch of trying to understand why people act the way they do, based on what the descriptions or what the ideas we have of that God may or may not be like. So he tries to just dismiss it offhand, and it's one huge non sequitur. In my opinion, it's going to come down to opinion. There are going to be some parts in here where he's going to be standing here and I'm going to be standing here, and just to say I don't see it that way. And so it's looking at two different things from two different perspectives. So I'm going to have to divide it up into two sections, because the first half he's making his argument in the chapter, and then the second half he goes off on a whole bunch of other things. He talks about a whole bunch of other things. He ends up by the end of the chapter, where his reasoning leads him is quite crazy, actually, because by the end of the chapter, he's advocating torture as a sensible form of warfare. And he's advocating it as a sensible, viable option for human behavior. And at the same time, he reaches the conclusion that pacifism is wrong, right? And he makes his argument for that. So you can see he starts off by trying to eliminate theology as a viable field of study, but look at what conclusions come from that. And it was the same thing with Dawkins and the selfish gene. What are the conclusions of relying only on evolution? Because that's where he puts his foundation for ethics in here, for a science of good and evil. He says it's based on the study of the study of consciousness, so that when you understand if something has a consciousness, it's a sentient being, then it can suffer, then you can evaluate right and wrong. But he says it has to be all based on evolution. He says you can't bring God into the picture, because God appears to be a contradiction from his perspective, and from the perspective of people like Bertrand, Russel, and Richard Dawkins, and other people, and Christopher Hitchens. Hitchens says what can be asserted without evidence, and this is his big nail that he tries to fix everything together. He said, in fact, he ends a paragraph, he ends a part of the chapter with this: what can be asserted without evidence can also be dismissed without evidence. And we can see that his arguments previously, he's already tried to dismiss the Bible as not being a reliable source of evidence, so he dismisses it offhand, and his own reasoning mind dismisses the idea of God waiting millions of years to create the universe and then reaching a point where Stalin comes on the scene. He says this is inconsistent with an all-powerful God, or where we reach a point in history where smallpox develops. He says this is inconsistent with a God that is benevolent, or any type of God, let alone benevolent. So I see where he's going in this chapter, and he's using all his energy in this chapter. The previous chapter was a walk in the park. This one is something that you really have to pause and say, okay, where is he going with this? Now, that is the problem. Hitchens says what can be asserted without evidence. He's saying in this statement that the assertions of theology are without evidence. And this is just not true. It's simply not true. We have evidence that Jesus Christ walked on the earth. We have a record of his words that he spoke that I believe are spiritual words, and that when somebody reads those words, they get a different understanding about ethics and ideas. Don't forget, when Christ came, he changed the view of ethics that were existing at the time, that were based on Moses alone. And instead he came and said, don't just judge by he said, don't just judge by the letter of the law. He said, judge with righteous judgment. When he was breaking the law at the time, he was breaking the Sabbath by healing somebody. And he said, don't just look at the letter of the law. You got to look at the heart of what is right and proper and righteous. And he was trying to instill that in people with his teachings, with the Sermon on the Mount, and with the story of the Good Samaritan. And these things, these stories, these testimonies of Christ are dismissed. They say, well, this doesn't count because it's 2,000 years old, and anything that's old, they were burning cats back then. So you can see that they're dismissing something for which there is evidence. And not only is there evidence, when they try and recreate their own ethics, they come back to the same thing. They come back to the golden rule. So there's something wrong in their reasoning there. There's something that's not jiving, that's not meshing, it's not fitting together. They end up contradicting themselves. They end up getting themselves into a circular argument, and they end up bringing forth non sequiturs. They say something and it doesn't follow from the reasoning that they've said previously. Now, I don't have the skill, I don't have the mental strength to go through this in detail, but there's bound to be somebody to come along that's able to address this better than I can. Either that, I would have to spend a lot more time on it, and I'm trying to get through this book. I want to move on to Hitchens' book that I'm looking forward to examining. He said he wrote a book called God Is Not Great. I want to examine that, and so I could spend a month on chapter 6 alone and still have to make sure that I'm covering all the bases of what they're doing here. But this is basically the summation of what ends up happening. He starts off the chapter by rejecting any references to any type of Judeo-Christian Muslim God, or any kind of God of the universe for that matter, and then he brings it to a result saying, well, this is what ethics should be based on. It should be based on evolutionary principles. I'm glad Dawkins is not here to chime in, because he'd probably say it's an example of extended phenotype or something like that, which I don't even want to, I refuse to even entertain something like that is based on no foundation at all. Just that it must have happened this way, and it had to happen like that. It had to be like this, right? No, it didn't have to be anything. It's Christ came to earth to show us what God is like and say, hey, you're not like God your Father. You have a problem that needs to be fixed. Your mind is not able to be righteous. And so he's giving us an avenue, a channel of how to reconcile with God. And people don't want to hear that. They say, no, I don't want to have anything to do with that. They block their ears and they say, oh, you're talking religion, and I only want, but they're gladly accept. It's no different than what the apostle said. He said, if someone comes in their own name, you'll gladly listen to them. But if somebody comes sharing the truth of God or something about what Christ might have said, you say, oh, no, I don't want anything to do with that. And it's very sad that they will reject the words of Christ. In fact, they would prefer to take the Bible as a whole, the 66 books of the Bible, and use that as a target, because it's much easier for them to dismiss. They say, well, the whole book is all these things have errors in them, so you got to dismiss the whole thing. And that is not a fair argument at all. That's not a fair way to dismiss something. There's words of Scripture that have extreme value. The Psalms, the prophets, and the words of Christ. These are things that have specific things to say about ethics and good and evil, and we can learn from them. But what he wants to do is dismiss all that, because he dismisses the evidence for it, and say, okay, we're going to start just with a scientific foundation for ethics, a scientific foundation for good and evil, and all these things are just going to pass away over time, and in the future he's thinking that there won't be a field called theology. That'll just go the way of the dinosaur, and everything will be scientifically based. Well, you don't have to look very far to see where that's leading us today. If you only look at humanity from the perspective of genes and promulgating the gene pool, then right and wrong starts to lose its power. The ethics get worse. They don't get better. By abandoning the scriptures and the prophets and the words of Christ, do ethics get better or get worse? He says, oh, they get better, because now we can really have a scientific foundation for good and evil. And I would argue, no, they get worse. People end up treating humans worse when they just think, oh, they're just a collection of DNA, and they're really unimportant on a global scale. They compare the individual human to the global earth, and the earth becomes more important than humans, of course. And what's the natural result of that? Get rid of the humans, right? That's the philosophy of Stalin. That's the philosophy of leaders that become corrupt through their great power. They adopt atheism, and they think, well, humans don't matter. I can kill off millions of humans. It doesn't matter. The biggest atrocities in the world can develop from this type of doctrine. That's where it's going. That's where it's leading me. I'm not driving that ship. He's driving the ship, and he's telling me what he believes. So I'm comparing it to what I know is the truth, which is Jesus Christ, the truth, his words. Anyway, that's as far as I got in chapter 6. I had to read it twice. I'll have to go from there. Thank you so much for watching. God bless you. Take care. I love you. Bye bye.